Margaret Chukwuemeka was not the type of woman to whisper. She had spent her youth outrunning poverty and her adulthood outbuilding men who once mocked her. Now 61, she owned plazas, estates, and government contracts like trophies. Her hair shimmered with iron-gray grace, her eyes with ruthless ambition. But even with 3 mansions and 4 honorary doctorates, something small gnawed at her legacy. Her son, Chuka, the bachelor billionaire, refused to marry. Every time someone mentioned grandchildren, Margaret smiled politely, but her fist curled under the table. Her empire was flawless. Her family tree, however, had a stubborn, glaring gap. Chuka wasn't broken, just uninterested. 35, Oxford-educated, and chairman of multiple companies, he was an enigma. Women adored him, men respected him, and tabloids chased him. But he dodged romance like taxes. So Margaret created a solution, a hunt. She didn't call it that, of course. But she printed business cards, crafted a golden notebook of non-negotiables, and traveled across Lagos, Abuja, and Enugu with precision. She grilled women over champagne brunches and communion wafers. "Are you godly or just trendy?" she'd ask. "Would you rather raise children or Instagram followers?" Some blinked. Some lied. One tried to seduce her driver. Margaret believed in efficiency. She visited churches not for worship, but for intelligence gathering. She crashed wedding receptions to observe bridal behavior. In salons, she eavesdropped under steaming dryers. Each woman she encountered got a mental scorecard: beauty, intellect, domestic competence, ambition. One candidate recited Psalm 23, then failed to name Nigeria's vice president. Another claimed she could cook ogbono blindfolded but didn't know how to boil yam. Nonsense, Margaret muttered in traffic. She began to lose hope. Even the supposedly virtuous ones spoke about yachts and Dubai before they mentioned marriage. Chuka had become prey, and they were circling. Then came Bianca. Tall, eloquent, Harvard graduate. She hosted a tech podcast, ran a startup, and called Margaret mogul with reverent respect. Margaret's hope stirred. Over avocado toast in a high-rise lounge, Bianca answered every question with polished confidence. She quoted scripture and quoted stock prices. Finally, Margaret smiled, until her driver whispered something odd. That night, Margaret Googled Bianca. Her heart dropped. Bianca was married. Not formally. Currently. Secretly. To a UK man who called her his green card queen. The betrayal scorched. Margaret poured herself a glass of red wine and circled a line in her notebook: deciment degrees. By now, her checklist had grown longer and lonelier. Must be smart, but not cunning. Must be soft, but not spineless. Must respect wealth, but not worship it. Must see beyond beauty, yet remain beautiful. The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. She had spent her life making impossible things possible, turning swamps into estates, bribes into blessings. But this felt different. This was personal. At 3 a.m., she stared at Chuka's childhood photos, one where he held a toy helicopter, another where he tried to bake a cake for her birthday. She touched the edges of the frame. "I find her," she whispered. It was a Thursday. The rain had threatened but not arrived. Margaret's driver was stuck in traffic, so she wandered into a bookstore beside a small cafe in Yaba, more out of boredom than interest. The smell hit her first: dust, ink, and nostalgia. She browsed aimlessly, until she saw her. Standing between a copy of Achebe's Anthills of the Savannah and Michelle Obama's Becoming, the young woman read silently, unaware of the world. She wore no makeup. Her skin glowed anyway, bronze like baked earth after rain. Margaret narrowed her eyes. No wig. No lashes. Just clarity. Something stirred. The woman didn't look up even as Margaret approached. No fear. No flinching. Just focus. Margaret liked that. She asked the shopkeeper her name. Amora, he said. Lecturer at Unilag. Margaret waited outside. When Amora came out with 2 books in her hand and Zobo stains on her sleeve, Margaret introduced herself with a warm smile. Not the usual one, the real one. She invited Amora to lunch. Amora agreed. Not out of awe, but curiosity. At the restaurant, Margaret studied her across a bowl of pepper soup. The girl didn't reach for her phone. Didn't flatter. Didn't fidget. Just watched back. Margaret asked subtle questions, woven through laughter and slow sips of zobo. Are you close to your family? What matters more, a man's heart or his hustle? Can you fry plantain and defend a thesis? Amora answered without effort, her voice even and low, as if she spoke only when necessary. Margaret waited for the usual signs, greed, performance, desperation, but none came. Then she said, "You haven't asked what my son does." Amora smiled, barely. "That's because I earn mine." Margaret blinked. For the first time in years, she felt seen. She didn't just hear the answer, she felt its weight. "Would you like to meet him?" Margaret asked eventually. Amora tilted her head. "Only if he wants to meet me." That night, Margaret returned home and told Chuka about her. He didn't roll his eyes this time. He asked, "What's she like?" And Margaret, a woman of sharp words and sharper instincts, paused. "She reminds me of no one," she said. And maybe that's the point. When Chuka finally met Amora, the room didn't burst into music. But something shifted, like dust settling after a storm. Amora didn't laugh at his jokes. She asked better ones. Chuka didn't try to impress. He tried to understand. 3 weeks passed. Margaret watched from a distance. She pretended not to care. But she noticed things, how Amora never called Chuka unless he called first. How she wore the same earrings to every lunch, even when they met the president's daughter. How Chuka, once allergic to weddings, now stayed late at family events, always beside Amora. Margaret waited for the cracks. But they never came. Not the dramatic kind, anyway. Just the quiet ones, like Chuka asking for recipe books or Amora helping him fix a speech. Margaret closed her notebook one night. Her mission was no longer a hunt. It was hope. One evening, while watching the news, Margaret's phone buzzed. It was Chuka. He asked, casually, "Where can I get a quiet engagement ring?" Something simple. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't gasp. She just leaned back into her chair and smiled. Finally, she muttered. But in her chest, something swelled, relief, pride, and maybe, something like peace. The kind that doesn't announce itself, just settles in quietly like dusk. She poured herself some tea. The steam danced like smoke from a battle she had just won. Not with weapons, but with wisdom. And faith in one good woman. People said Margaret controlled the Chukwuemeka empire. That she was the iron behind the glass. The queenmaker. But she knew better. Power wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it looked like patience in a bookshop. Sometimes, it smelled like pepper soup and zobo. Real power wasn't in what you built, it was in who you chose to build with. And now, as Amora quietly entered their lives, not like thunder, but like sunrise, Margaret understood. She hadn't just found a wife for her son. She had passed a legacy to someone who wouldn't break it. And that, more than all her mansions, was wealth. The moment Chuka sat across from Amora, something unnerved him. Not her presence, she was graceful, but not intimidating. It was her stillness. Her gaze didn't dart, her smile didn't try. She sat like someone who had nothing to prove. He was used to women who leaned in, who flattered and sparkled. But Amora leaned back. She didn't ask how many companies he owned. She asked why he named one Obi and Sons when he had no son. Chuka blinked. For the first time in a long time, he didn't have a rehearsed answer. Just a memory, and a wound. Chuka had spent his life building things. Offices. Brands. Even ideas of himself. He knew how to dress power. How to wear silence like a suit. But somewhere in the vault of success, he had lost softness. Lost honesty. He often wondered if women loved him or his access. Even his friends walked on eggshells, afraid to offend the empire. But that night, over chin-chin and laughter, Amora didn't seem impressed. She didn't ask about his London flat. She asked about his fears. "What keeps you up at night?" she'd said. Chuka laughed nervously. But the truth stayed clawing at his chest. They began seeing each other weekly, quietly, without fanfare. Amora asked him to attend a lecture at her university. He wore jeans, not a blazer. She served him food in plastic bowls, not golden cutlery. Each visit stripped away a layer of billionaire armor. One day, she said she didn't believe in fairy tale marriages, only partnerships rooted in respect. "Love is not magic," she said. "It's management." Chuka chuckled, but her words lingered. Margaret watched from the sidelines. No diamonds had been exchanged. No hashtags posted. But something real was blooming. And for the first time, it didn't need her supervision. Amora never announced her presence. She never dominated a room, yet no one forgot her. Chuka noticed how she made friends with the waiters before the guests. How she sat with his cousins without a phone in sight. How she stayed behind to help clear plates after a party where everyone else posed for photos. When a business associate whispered to Chuka, "She's too simple for you," he felt something crack. He didn't defend her. He didn't need to. The silence that followed made the man shift awkwardly and apologize. That was when Chuka realized, simplicity wasn't weakness. It was strength untamed. One afternoon, Margaret called Amora to her home alone. No agenda. No audience. Just tea and scrutiny. She watched how Amora held the teacup. How she crossed her legs. How she complimented the cook but didn't flatter the host. "What if my son loses everything tomorrow?" Margaret asked suddenly. Amora looked at her, steady. "Then he'll have the chance to learn who he really is." Margaret blinked. That night, she opened the safe in her study and placed her golden notebook inside. She didn't burn it. She didn't shred it. But she closed it like a book that had reached its ending. Margaret began noticing little things. Chuka smiled more. He visited the old family compound in Enugu after years of silence. He called her just to say good morning, something he hadn't done since university. One evening, he even asked for her jollof rice recipe, though his chef could prepare meals with a phone app. Amora hadn't changed Chuka. She had reminded him who he was before the boardrooms, before the billion. Margaret stood by the kitchen door, listening to their quiet laughter. She felt the corners of her heart unclench. The battle was over, not with noise, but with nourishment. There was no flash mob. No rooftop restaurant. No fireworks. Chuka proposed in his living room, barefoot, while Amora read a book beside him. He placed the ring on the table between them, not on her finger. She looked at it. Then looked at him. Then nodded. That was all. No announcement followed. No photo shoots. Just a phone call to Margaret that began with, "It's done." And she, who had imagined an orchestra and maybe even a Dove release, simply said, "Okay." But deep inside, she exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding since her son turned 30. Introducing the families was the final test. Amora's parents were school teachers. Kind, humble, deeply protective of their daughter. Chuka's uncles, dressed like senators, arrived with side eyes and suspicions. "She's not from money," one whispered. "She might not understand our name." But Amora greeted each guest with quiet grace. She didn't try to charm, just to connect. She helped serve drinks. She laughed when someone spilled palm wine. By night's end, even the coldest aunt was warming to her. The elders whispered to Margaret later, "She's different." Margaret smiled. "She's necessary. Because not every home needs a queen. Some just need an anchor." The night before the small engagement ceremony, Margaret sat alone in her room, flipping through an old family album. Photos of Chuka in sun-stained school uniforms, of her late husband fixing the gate, of birthdays filled with balloons and burnt rice. She posed on a faded picture of herself holding baby Chuka beside a half-painted wall. She remembered how she prayed then, desperately, for a future she couldn't afford. Now, the future stood outside her door, wearing flat shoes and reading poetry. Margaret wasn't emotional by nature. But that night, she let a tear fall. Just one. Enough to say, we made it. The engagement was small, just family and friends. No influencers. No sponsors. Just joy. Amora wore ivory, not gold. Chuka wore his father's old watch. Margaret, regal in lace and quiet pride, stood beside them. She didn't give a long speech. She didn't need to. As guests hugged and music played softly, she leaned in and whispered into Amora's ear, "Thank you for not failing my interview." Amora smiled, brushing her fingers gently against Margaret's shoulder. "Thank you for passing mine." For a moment, the two women stood still, one who searched, one who waited. Both architects. Both builders. And finally, both family. No magazine featured their story. No viral clip was made. But something permanent had been written that day, in laughter, in sacrifice, in the quiet courage to choose meaning over noise. Years later, when people spoke of the Chukwuemeka legacy, they didn't just mention contracts and towers. They mentioned Margaret's persistence, Chuka's transformation, and Amora's quiet fire. Not every empire is made of steel. Some are built from moments, small ones, that bend the future gently into place. And in that place, legacy is not just money. It's wisdom passed without words. After the wedding, Amora didn't change. She didn't start wearing designer shoes or hiring stylists. She continued lecturing. Continued volunteering. Continued being. People whispered she wasn't fitting into billionaire life. But they didn't realize she wasn't trying to fit. She was reshaping it. The foundation of the Chukwuemeka family had once been concrete and currency. Now, it was character. When Chuka traveled, he called home twice a day. When Margaret hosted parties, Amora stood beside her, not behind. Two women who had tested each other and found iron, not glass. And in their quiet alliance, they raised not just wealth, but honor.